that lame story about Warrow. As if you'd come all this way just to talk about a stupid phone call. I know why you're here. Chris, I don't... You saw, didn't you? The dirt on Monica's feet. You noticed it at the scene when you looked under the duvet. I had a feeling you did. There was no going back from that admission. Ruby nodded. She didn't want her colleague to be under suspicion for murder. She didn't want any of this. But the sooner she could get an admission, the quicker she could trace Sophie's location. I couldn't understand why the post-mortems were drawing a blank. So I checked and rechecked the photos. I was going to suggest soil sample analysis, because the soles of Monica's feet were dirty at the scene. But then when I checked the crime scene photos, her feet were clean. How did you do that? I know what I saw. Emma was there taking photos when we pulled back the duvet. How did she miss it? Chris folded his arms. Emma was thrilled when I told her your DI had a soft spot for her. So when she followed you all out to the door, I cleaned Monica's feet with some wet wipes. When Emma came back in, she carried on taking photos. People don't question the forensic pathologist. It's one of the perks of the job. There was one last piece of the puzzle that was not fitting in. The door knocker killer was reported to be a woman. She had to be invited into people's homes. But Chris had displayed enough guilt to warrant an arrest. They would discuss the finer details back at the station. Straightening her posture, she recited the caution. Christopher Douglas, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. You do not have to say anything. A wave of nausea passed over her, and she swept her hair from her face. You do not have to, she repeated, trying to focus on the figure before her. His image split in two, and he blurred in and out of focus. Ruby swallowed, taking a step back to support herself against the wall. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you switch the teacups? You can't kid a kidder, Ruby. Isn't that what you always say? Oh, and by the way, they were both laced with sedatives. It's why I didn't fancy mine. Reaching into his back pocket, he pulled out 2 black-edged envelopes and waved them in her face. I'm playing postman today. Guess who these are for? One for you and one for Sophie. Perhaps I'll deliver them to Jack Downs instead. Jack. Ruby slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed the call button on her phone. For once, she was grateful for the push-button pad and could only pray that some kind of call went through. She had to get out, but as the sedatives hit her system, every step felt like lead. Where's Sophie? She asked, her words slurred as what felt like the world's worst headache wrapped around her skull. She's safe, for now. But the question is, what are we going to do with you? Chapter 65. What do you want? Downs said, his eyes narrowing in distrust. The last person Nathan wanted to turn to for help was a copper, much less the one Ruby had taken to her bed. But the phone call he had received left him no choice, and he used the swiftest way to get the man on side, as he uttered 3 words. Ruby's in trouble. How did you find my address? No, don't tell me. I don't want to know. Downs led Nathan into the living room of his 2-bedroom London townhouse. It still carried the feminine touch of the wife who had passed on a year earlier. Floral patterned wallpaper, soft furnishings, and a collection of Swarovski crystals in a cabinet. Hardly the decor of a bachelor pad. Nathan knew all about Downs, because he made it his business to investigate Ruby's closest friends. The 2 men eyed each other warily as Nathan dipped his hand into the pocket of his black combat trousers. Not his usual weekend attire, but the concealed pockets were effective for carrying weapons, and he had a feeling that he might need them. I got a voicemail from Ruby. Listen. Ruby's muffled voice came into life as Nathan pressed the speaker button on his phone. He had listened to it 3 times now, and the slur in her voice set him on edge. Where's Sophie? A rustling noise ensued. Phone against cloth, or a pocket, Nathan thought. A voice responded. She's here. Would you like to meet her? Downs frowned as they leaned into the phone. Nathan caught his expression and mouthed, Who? Downs pushed his finger against his lips as the conversation continued. Why, Chris? Why did you kill those women? Nathan tensed as he caught a glint of recognition in Downs's eye. He wanted to get going, but he didn't know who Chris was. Was it a male or female name? It was impossible to tell. The conversation continued as Chris spoke in a taut voice. It doesn't matter anymore. It's over. Now down you go like a good girl. It's okay. You'll have company. I'm not going down there, Ruby replied, before the phone went dead. Where's Ruby? Nathan said. And who the hell is Chris? Chris Douglas, by the sounds of it. He's our forensic pathologist. I wondered what Ruby was up to when she requested that credit check. Downs rubbed the stubble on his chin. But how? All this time we thought it was a woman? Lacing his shoes, he craned his neck up at Nathan. I've got to go. You've had a drink, Nathan said, eyeing the half-empty decanter of whiskey on the coffee table before him. He would have gladly left without him, but he needed Chris's location. Nathan gave him a wry glance. We'll get there quicker in my car. Downs did not argue. Nathan's Mercedes SL400 was far superior to Downs's Ford, and having a detective inspector in the front seat would negate any police stops along the way. It would not do his street cred any good, but Nathan was beyond the point of caring. All he wanted right now was to find Ruby, and if he could trace the location of the missing child, then all the better. But as he tore up the streets, he had a feeling it would not end well. The car purred under pressure, attracting admiring glances from pedestrians as the grey metallic paintwork gleamed under the grimy streetlights. When did you last see her? Nathan said, flipping on the wipers to negate the shower of rain. A couple of hours ago, Downs replied. At work, he hastily added. But she's been getting death notes addressed specifically to her? Shit, Nathan said, his voice softening. Ruby. We have a daughter together. She thought she was to blame. But when I last spoke to Ruby, she said she was on someone else's trail. I know, Downs said. You know? Nathan repeated, his eyes fixed on the road. It added a new layer to their friendship. Ruby rarely confided in anyone, unless she was at a low ebb. So either Downs and Ruby were getting closer, or she was in a bad place. I was digging into local adoption records, so she knew I'd find out anyway, Downs said, easing into Nathan's concerns. She was getting emails. She thought Lucy was stalking her. His daughter had admitted to Nathan that she had rung Ruby once and visited Joy in the care home, just to say hello. Oakwood's address had been provided by Lenny, an effort to stir the pot. But further probing revealed that that was as far as it went, and no emails had been exchanged. And now she's been drugged by some psycho posing as our daughter. Fuck it, Nathan said, smacking the heel of his hand against the steering wheel. All these years I've been keeping an eye on her, and the moment I step back this happens. He jabbed a finger at Downs, taking him by surprise, as fury raged in his eyes. You were meant to be looking after her. Where were you tonight? She's being stalked by a nutter, and you let her find her own way home? It wasn't like that. She said she was working late. She was meant to get a taxi. Nathan returned his gaze to the road. You should never have left her alone. You're all the same, you lot. No loyalty. Well, let me tell you, if anything happens to her, Ruby's not an ornament you put aside to look at. She's your own woman. Downs turned his attention back to his phone as units called to say they were en route. ETA in 5 minutes. That means, Downs said. I know what ETA means. Silence fell between them as Nathan navigated the road. Downs frowned, lowering his window to take in some air. Your family have caused Ruby nothing but grief. I know what you and your brother have been getting up to. The sooner he goes back to prison, the happier I'll be. Don't give me that, Nathan said. Ruby knows the score. If we weren't there to keep a lid on things, there'd be anarchy. If my brother's been involved in anything, it's been restoring order upon his return. Is that what you call it? Restoring order? And what about Ruby? Was he restoring order when he put a knife to her throat? What are you talking about? So you don't know? Is that how you do business then? I thought you two were tight. Nathan's jaw tightened. If you've got something to say, then spill it now. Lenny's got a screw loose. Ruby was going home when he pulled a knife on her in the lift. Threatened rape, by all accounts. So why don't you look closer to home before you start lecturing me about looking after her? Nathan shifted in his seat. He had no reason to disbelieve what Downs was saying. That must have been the night that Ruby went to the flat, and it explained why she took a knife to bed. Yet she had not told him. This was all his fault. I wanted to have him arrested, but she wouldn't allow it. Lenny threatened to pay her mother a visit and finish her off. Such a kind and compassionate man, your brother. Picking on women and the elderly. Yeah, I'd say he's a real asset to the community. What did you want me to do? Nathan said, pulling up to a set of traffic lights. Sort him out. If you won't, we will. Nathan inhaled a deep breath, his fists clenched over the steering wheel. He needed to regroup, focus on the task ahead. What's the killer's MO? Downs silently stared out the window, seemingly incapable of relinquishing the words. Finally, he cleared his throat to speak. The victims have died from stab wounds, with attempts at asphyxiation. They had ligature marks on wrists and ankles. Splinters of baubles were found in Emily Edmonds' stomach. What kind of weird shit is that? It's the kind of weird shit we're dealing with. Nathan negotiated the traffic until the streets of inner London melted away, bringing them to a tree-lined avenue on the outskirts of Greenwood. Thoughts spun in his head like a fairground waltzer as he tried to concentrate on the road. Why had he gone for Ruby like that when she was only doing her job? He'd come so close to giving up everything to be with her. Was he self-sabotaging because he was scared of letting her in? It was obvious Lenny was pulling his strings and had set the whole thing up. And if he hadn't got to his daughter in time, and she was his daughter, the DNA test had made that clear. She was holed up in a spa with his mum now, trying to comprehend the situation. As much as Frances proudly referred to her as a Crosby, she carried her mother's dark features. Eyes you could fall into, never to return. Ruby. He needed her more than ever. He couldn't do this on his own. Turn left here, Downs said, his ear glued to his phone. Nathan recognized the houses from his estate agent's listing. It was the same street Monica Sherwood had been discovered, one of the latest victims of the door knocker killer. It had not taken Downs long to find out Chris Douglas's home address, and they'd arrived on par with the police units he had alerted. The strength of Nathan's heartbeat swished in his ears as he abandoned his car to run up the driveway to Chris Douglas's front door. The steady thump of his 9mm Glock pistol thumped against his thigh as he ran. Chapter 66. A vice-like pain gripped Ruby's forehead as she raised her head from the unforgiving floor. "Where am I?" she said, her voice echoing in the darkness. Waking up disorientated was not unusual, but the blackness of her surroundings grew fresh fears as she failed to seek out the chink of light that spoke of home. Groaning, she struggled to rise. A wave of dread washed over her as she realized her ankles and wrists were bound. Groping in the darkness, her fingers traced the outline of woolen fringes. It was a rug. Was she in the basement of Chris's home? She needed to think quickly in order to get her bearings. Sliding into a sitting-up position, Ruby scooted back until she felt a bare brick wall, leaning against it long enough to ease the dizziness penetrating her brain. A dry, bitter aspirin taste permeated the roof of her mouth, but the full memory of her most recent event was slow in coming. She desperately needed to regain some focus. There had to be an opening, she thought, a doorway out. A sudden breath made her heart work double time. She was not alone. "Who's there?" she said, her voice echoing against the oppressive brick walls. Torchlight seared her pupils, and she blinked as she focused her gaze. Ruby recoiled as the memories finally returned. Chris confessing to being the killer, then admitting to drugging her tea. How long had he been sitting in the darkness with her? The figure chuckled as it watched her flounder. Ruby leaned against the wall, forcing herself to her feet. The room was a cavernous chamber, long and bare, with furniture cloaked in dust curtains further down. To the left was a staircase leading to a closed door. Slime laced the walls, and Ruby inhaled a fetid smell. Somewhere on the periphery, the urgency of the case made itself known. Sophie. What had he done with the little girl? Ruby gained enough composure to challenge her captor. "The police are on their way, so you'd better untie me now." Another low laugh. But this time, Ruby made out a feminine lilt. She blinked in quick succession, her eyes darting around the room for a weapon. The echo of footsteps filled the hollow chamber as her captor flicked on the light overhead. It was not Chris before her, but a woman. The white smock covering her dress, like a butcher's apron, was decorated in a smattering of dried blood. She stepped under the dim light bulb, revealing her identity, and in doing so, she stole the air from Ruby's lungs. "Goldie, is that you?" Ruby whispered, peering around the darkened room for her accomplice. At least she had been spared a gag. But then, why would her captor gag her when she had gone to so much trouble to reel her in? Goldie's smile lacked the gold-plated teeth and the beehive hairstyle. Now, with her shaven head, hastily applied makeup and peculiar dress, she didn't look like herself at all. "Hello, Ruby. Would you like to play a little game?" Ruby wanted to launch herself at her, to pin her down and extract Sophie's whereabouts. But she was in no position to fight. The only thing holding up her shaking legs was the firmness of the brick wall behind her. "Where's Chris?" Ruby said, seeking out Goldie's accomplice in the darkened room. "Serving her eye a purpose," Goldie said, still wearing a fiendish smile. "I thought it would be cozier with just us girls." "And Sophie?" "Asleep." She tilted her head to one side as she examined her nails. How is Kathy, by the way? Kathy? Just what's going on? Ruby said. If she could get answers to the smaller questions, perhaps she would get clues to the bigger ones too, such as Sophie's location. You're dying to know, aren't you? Goldie smiled. You were placed in care, Ruby said, preempting her response. Just like with Anita, time was ticking, and she might not be as lucky this time. She bit the inside of her gum and was rewarded with a sting of pain that brought with it sharp focus. Kathy and I were fostered by the same parents after her adoptive mum died. I'd forgotten all about her until she found me on Facebook and asked to meet up. Oh, Ruby said, feeling a pang of sadness. Goldie was a born liar, but that piece of information made sense. That's how you saw her birth certificate, wasn't it? How you knew my name and the time of birth. She knew by the glint in Goldie's eyes that she had been responsible for the death notes, as well as the murders. I went through her stuff when she wasn't looking. How could I forget a name like that? R.I.P. You looked so alike I thought it had to be you. Sure enough, when I tested the waters, you emailed straight back. So you tried to pin the murders on Kathy. That's what it was really all about. What it was about was finding my happy ending. But I had to get rid of the bodies, and Kathy was there. Until you found out that Nathan was her father. I saw the look on your face when I told you he had a vested interest. As they were unmarried, Nathan had not been listed on the birth certificate. It suited Ruby at the time. The fact her daughter had originated from a family of criminals was something she had not wanted her to know. So you switched the blame to someone else. Chris. You were blackmailing him because he was a client. That's why chunks of money kept disappearing from his bank account. I'm impressed, Goldie said, pushing her hand into her apron pocket and pulling out a lighter and packet of cigarettes. Her face lit in an orange fuse as the lighter clicked into life. Closing her eyes, she dragged on the cigarette, blowing the smoke towards the cobwebbed ceiling. You want one? She said, holding out the cigarettes. Ruby nodded. Anything to escape her bindings. She had grazed her knuckles from rubbing the rope against the wall, but it was showing no signs of loosening. Well, tough, Goldie said, pushing the packet back into her apron. Chris had mummy issues. Liked to do it in all sorts of places, including his workplace. He would have paid anything to keep me sweet. So when the money dried up, he let me use his place instead. She took another drag of her cigarette. Want to know a funny thing? He got a kick out of that too. Started advising me on how to cover up my tracks, told me where to dump the bodies. Even came to the house after I killed Harry Edmonds. Then he'd turn up later on, with you, ready to make sure nothing was traced back to me. If you were such good friends, why was he ringing my DCI asking for help? Ruby said. Goldie gave a half-shoulder shrug. Doesn't matter now, it's all over. There's no happy ending. Not for any of us. Ruby felt chilled by the words. Goldie was referring to Chris in the past tense. He had outlived his usefulness, just like the others. I don't believe you, Ruby said, trying to buy some time. If backup was on its way, they needed Goldie to tell them what she had done with Sophie. Those murders took time. You said yourself that Frenchie never gave you 5 minutes peace. Goldie gave a low, mean chuckle. Frenchie's dead. I've been running the girls, not him. Chris helped me get rid of him too. We hid his body under the floorboards, but it isn't half kicking up a stink. It's not too late to recover this. What have you done with Sophie? But Goldie was gazing beyond Ruby, somewhere she could not reach. None of those people deserved to live. I gave them every chance and they all failed miserably, just like you. Ruby's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The room was quiet. Too quiet. She needed the sounds of the streets, the scent of pollution, voices from the room next door. An insect scurried over her hand, and she pushed herself away from the wall, kicking off her heels in order to stay upright. Ruby forced her focus back on Goldie. You took refuge in the movie Lucy's First Christmas, didn't you? Waiting for a mother that never came. And I waited so long, Goldie said, her voice etched with pain. I'd sleep to the tune of my music box, praying I'd wake up to see her waiting to take me home. I really thought I'd found her this time, but Anita was just like all the others. Goldie pulled at her thumb, ripping off the prosthetic piece and throwing it on the ground. I made myself look nice so she'd take me in, but she only cared about her perfect little girl. There was no room for me. Where is she? Where's Sophie? Ruby said, her words falling on deaf ears. She wrestled with her bindings, loosening them a fraction, then realized that Goldie was staring at her. Silence passed between them, two souls forced into solitude. My birth mother's dead, Goldie finally spoke. Suicide. Couldn't live with the disappointment, I suppose. A bitter laugh escaped from her mouth. But then, I've done some terrible things. Goldie sighed, a smile touching her lips as she briefly closed her eyes. Have you ever killed anyone? No. Let me tell you, the rush of a kill is better than any drug. It surprised me in the end. The reward became more important than fulfilling the dream. So the childhood fantasy was not so innocent after all, Ruby said, the disgust evident on her face. It's over. Untie me and take me to Sophie. Goldie extinguished her cigarette with the sole of her lace-up boot. You forced my hand when you knocked on Chris's door. If you'd brought backup, she'd be safe in your arms now. Her death is on your head. Where is she? Ruby asked, her chest rising as she battled the rising tide of frustration. If she didn't get out of this place soon, she couldn't be held responsible for her actions. Goldie smiled. I told you, she's asleep, frozen in time like Sleeping Beauty. But the minutes are ticking away. She waved a finger from left to right. Tick-tock, tick-tock. If she's not dead already, she soon will be. And you've nobody but yourself to blame. You monster! She's just a little girl! Ruby raged, unable to hold it in. Within 3 strides, Goldie was upon her, and it was only then that she caught sight of the scalpel, an instrument Chris must have used countless times before. Get back! Ruby pushed herself back against the wall. With one sweeping kick, Goldie took her legs, and the floor rose up to meet her as Ruby's face connected with a thud. Dropping to her knees, Goldie dragged Ruby's head onto her lap. Shh! Hush now, Mummy, Goldie said, stroking her hair. It's time. I have to make the bad stuff go away. Get off me, Ruby said, wriggling her entire body. But her movements were halted as the metal blade was thrust under her jaw. Ruby gasped and became very, very still. But unknown to Goldie, her hands were still moving. Inch by inch, she twisted her wrists against the bindings, loosening the badly tied knot. It's good that we're together. You wouldn't want to die alone, would you? Goldie said sadly. I don't like the thought of that at all. Think about what you're doing. Please, I can help, Ruby said, staring up at her face. She worked her wrists against the prickly rope, her flesh stinging against the insistent pressure. Beads of sweat broke out on Ruby's forehead as the knot loosened. She needed time. There was still hope. Briefly closing her eyes, Goldie re-emerged with a smile. It was a clown-like grin, which spread across her features in fetid glee. My name's Lucy. Are you my mummy? The childlike voice echoed around them. I can be, if you want, Ruby said, wearing a tight smile. Then say it, Mummy, please. Say you love me. Tell me you'll bring me home. Ruby did not think twice. She would say anything to extend precious seconds of their time. She took a deep breath. But her words were cut short as an arterial spray of warm blood slapped against her skin. Chapter 67. Kathy was a good kid, and despite everything, she said she needed her mother. Nathan knew so little about her, but it was not too late to repair things, so long as he could get Ruby back safely. The thought of her being buried in a casket in the ground struck cold fear in his heart. It was an alien emotion, and he tried to shake it off as he followed Downs down the driveway of Chris Douglas's house. He curled his fists. Replacing the emotion with the familiar lust for revenge had sharpened his focus. If Chris Douglas hurt a hair on Ruby's head, he would blow his fucking brains out. Thundering behind the police unit, he and Downs pushed their way through the front door. Broken hinged, it had been battered to submission. The last thing he expected to see was a man lying in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Fuck, Downs said. It's Chris. But Nathan had no sentiment for Chris. His focus was solely on Ruby. A lump of dread rose in his throat and wedged like a hard ball. There must be a basement, Nathan barked at the officers. She said something about going down. Try the garden too. Downs gave him a look which told him who was in charge, but Nathan didn't care. The detective inspector might have to play it by the book, but he didn't. Nervous energy erupted in his bloodstream as he pulled back the door of a cupboard under the stairs. Here, he shouted, lifting a panel on the floor which led to an underground stairwell. Feeling for a light, he adjusted his eyes to the darkness. The stench of bodily fluids and human remains were overpowering. These were smells he had encountered from a young age, when he was forced to watch his father's work. He entered the bowels of the room, resisting the urge to draw his pistol. Carrying a firearm would land him a prison sentence, and judging by their sideways glances, there were lots of officers here who would be too glad to collar a Crosby. Flicking on the light switch, he descended the steps to the basement. Ruby! He called out, his voice echoing in the dank space. Nathan's heart plummeted as he gazed around the empty room. Nothing but a swivel chair, a bent-up Christmas tree, and some old stains on a splintered wooden floor. Sure, the basement harboured life. The rat droppings and cobwebs were testament to that, and the smell of death reeked from the floorboards. But if Ruby was here, she had since been moved. They had found their killer all right. But where was Ruby now? Police boots echoed on the stairs as officers warily followed him down. They did not question their superior about Nathan's presence, and Downs did not offer any explanation. Who knew what they would uncover from beneath the floorboards? But Nathan was not here to solve past crimes. Downs rubbed his chin, disappointment evident on his face. Where's he taken her? Nathan said. You said he was a pathologist. Where does he work? We need to get to his office. I'll take it from here, Downs said. You're having a laugh if you think I'm stepping back now, Nathan replied, pushing past officers to hike up the stairs. But Downs was not far behind, matching him step for step. He must have known what Nathan was planning, because he was not allowing him out of his sight. Downs grabbed the door handle of his Mercedes and launched himself inside. Revving the engine, Nathan tore up the road. Listen, we both have one thing in common, and that's Ruby's welfare, Downs said, pushing his seatbelt into its holder. Just leave this to the police. If Ruby comes out of this place in one piece, then you've got your futures to consider. I won't come between you. That's very magnanimous of you, Nathan said, bemused, as if Downs ever stood in their way. I'm thinking of Ruby and what she'd won for her daughter. Having you in prison isn't one of them. Drop me off and then go home. I'll call and update when I get inside. Don't worry, Downs. I won't throw any punches. It's not how I do business, Nathan said. Downs raised an eyebrow, as if to say that was not what he had heard, but he stayed silent. Nathan pulled up outside the building and killed the engine of the car. Police sirens echoed in the distance, indicating they would not be alone for long. I'll give you 5 minutes, then I'm going in. Downs nodded in acknowledgement. A thin layer of perspiration shone on his forehead. Scrambling out of the car, he took long strides in the darkness towards the building. Neither of them noticed the thin sliver of crepe which had come loose from the front door. Edged with white ribbon, the breeze carried it away, along with any clues to Sophie's whereabouts. Chapter 68. Ruby heaved a gasp, involuntarily swallowing the fluids which had sprayed on her tongue. Goldie's head connected with the floor, the clang of the scalpel jerking from her hand. Goldie knew exactly where to slice for maximum impact, and now she was as good as dead. Pulling and tugging on the rope, Ruby cried out in frustration. The more her head cleared, the louder the voices became. You're trapped down here. They'll never find you. Trapped in the ground with a corpse and a million insects for company. No, Ruby whispered, her skin clammy with blood and newly formed sweat. Shuffling over to the scalpel, she grappled for purchase, being careful not to touch the blood-tinged blade. Razor sharp, it could have her fingers off in seconds. Goldie twitched behind her, her strangled breaths growing weaker. Blood pooled around them, the last few beats of a dying heart pumping it through the open wound. Ruby could feel it providing warmth as it soaked into her trousers. Wrapping her fingers tightly around the handle, she inched the blade towards her bindings and sawed. The rope parted with a satisfying crack, leaving her free to undo her ankles. Ruby was flooded with relief. It could so easily have been her lifeless on the floor. Pulling off her blazer, she wrapped the sleeve around Goldie's throat in an effort to plug the wound. It was like trying to stop the tide. But in this case, the tide was blood red. She had to leave, search the house for Sophie, and call for help. Goldie stared at the ceiling. Her lips parted, but devoid of breath, she had taken Sophie's whereabouts to the grave. Ruby rifled for her phone before rising to her feet. No signal. She needed to get out of here and call for help. Goldie's words replayed in her mind as she took the stairs, praying for an unlocked door. Just like Sleeping Beauty. The truth finally dawned. She knew exactly where Sophie was, and if she was right, she had just minutes to save her. Chapter 69. Ruby launched herself up the stairs, clinging onto the narrow railing for support. After checking Goldie's pockets, there were no keys to be found, and she prayed that the door had been left unlocked. Pulling back on the door, she was met with resistance. Without a phone signal, she had no way of alerting anyone of her whereabouts. She had pinned all her hopes on the fumbled call she made, but it must not have gone through. Banging on the door with clenched fists, she pounded the wooden barrier between her and the outside world. And then, in the silence, a crash of glass. Somewhere in the distance, someone was coming. Heavy footsteps drew nearer, approaching the other side of the door. "Help!" Ruby shouted. "I'm locked in, can you get me out?" "Ruby, it's me, Nathan. Stand back from the door." Ruby had never been so happy to hear his voice. She took a couple of steps down the stairs. Shielding her eyes, she waited as the crack of timber shattered the desolate air. Ruby caught Nathan on the top step as he kicked open the door. Drawing back a sudden breath, he took in her appearance. "You're hurt," he said, the words tumbling from his mouth as he checked her for injuries. Of course, the blood. She must have looked like something out of a horror movie. "It's okay," she said, batting him away as she stepped through the splintered door. "It's not mine, but we need to get to Sophie. I think I know where she is." Ruby wanted to ask how Nathan had found her, but such questions could come later. For now, there was a young life hanging in the balance. "Where's Chris?" Ruby said, throwing a glance over his shoulder. "He's dead," Nathan replied, leading her into the long dark corridor. So that was what Goldie meant when she said he was serving a higher purpose. Chris was her accomplice, and she had killed him to shift the focus from her. Ruby looked around the hall. It carried the same smell of disinfectant, but this was not Chris's house. "What? Where am I?" she asked, her words laced with confusion. Nathan frowned. "You're at the mortuary, don't you remember?" "I passed out. I thought I was in his basement." But as she got her bearings, she remembered why she was there. "But this is better. Come with me." Running with her bare feet slapping against the cold tiles, everything felt surreal. As if trapped in a nightmare, she galloped down the corridor, searching for the door which would provide her escape. She turned left. Pushing through the double doors, Nathan was right by her side. Laced with Goldie's blood, she must have looked a strange sight. Wild-eyed, she pushed her way through Downs and attending officers, their faces clouded in confusion as they stared at her bloodied face. "Call an ambulance," Ruby shouted. "Goldie's in the basement. She's cut her throat. I think she's dead." "Goldie?" Downs said, holding his hands out in front, as if he was calming a wild animal. "Ruby, stop for a minute. Tell me what's going on." Ruby darted past him, making her way to the mortuary freezers, where the bodies of the dead were kept. "I know where Sophie is." There was no time for questions. Downs and Nathan exchanged a glance before following Ruby in haste. "You start down there," she said, pointing to the end, "and I'll start here." Ruby grasped the handle, pulling back the long heavy drawer. It rolled on its wheels to reveal an elderly woman. Ghostly white, with sunken eyes, she was queued for the autopsy that was yet to come. But Ruby had no time to afford her the respect she deserved. Slamming back the door, she paused only to turn and pull out the next drawer. Nathan began in the middle, and Downs was at the end. Under the glow of strip lighting and the faint tang of disinfectant in the air, the only sounds were police boots pounding down the corridor to the basement, and the ominous rolling backwards and forwards of freezer drawers. "Ruby," Nathan said, his voice flat. Pulling open the rest of the drawer, he revealed a waif-like little girl, who was lying fully dressed, with hands bound in prayer. Frozen in time, just like Sleeping Beauty. "Help me get her out," Ruby breathed, clasping her hands under Sophie's armpits. She was cold, so very cold, and Ruby pressed her hand against Sophie's coat, praying for the comforting thump of a heartbeat. But there was nothing. "Over here, to the radiator," Ruby said, as Nathan gently lifted her up. For once, she was grateful for the stifling heat pumping through the building. Placing her on the ground, Ruby pressed her cheek against the little girl's face. Touching the artery in her neck, she held her own breath, willing Sophie's to return. She gasped a sigh of relief. "We've got a pulse." But the child was barely breathing. Nathan pulled off his jacket, wrapping it tightly around her, as Ruby drew the little girl into her arms. Like a life-size doll, she lay with blue lips and hands forced together. Reaching into his back pocket, Nathan drew out a Stanley knife, cutting the bindings and releasing her wrists. Downs stood, rooted to the spot, as he watched the couple try to breathe life into the little frozen girl. "Your coat," Nathan barked at him. "Give me your coat." Pulling off his heavy woolen coat, he threw it to Nathan, for once in his life devoid of words. Working together, Nathan and Ruby wrapped it tighter around Sophie. Pulling off her shoes, Nathan massaged her feet, then her fingers, cupping his hands and breathing hot air, pressing her to the radiator for warmth. Ruby drew her tighter, hugging her to her chest. Gently rocking, she begged in ragged whispers for the little girl to come back to them. "You're all right. You're going to be all right. Please wake up now. There's a good girl." And then she heard it, a little sigh of breath, followed by a tiny flush of colour to her cheeks. Nathan wrapped the coat tighter, encouraging murmurs passing his lips. In those few seconds, it was just Ruby, Nathan, and the skinny little dark-haired girl. "I'm sorry," Ruby whispered as she rocked, kissing the top of her head. But she did not know what she was sorry for. Was it for her own daughter, for Sophie, or for her mother, Anita, who was lying in hospital recovering from her ordeal? Downs turned to the window as he raised his radio to his lips, his face illuminated in the blue flashing lights. Ruby gently rocked the sedated child, unwilling to release her to the uniformed bodies bustling into the room. Police, ambulance and crime scene investigators flooded in. Head bowed, Downs updated his superiors by phone, pressing a finger against his ear as he engaged in conversation. "It's okay, you can let go now," a soothing voice spoke in Ruby's ear. She swiveled her head to see the green paramedic uniform and a pair of outstretched hands, waiting for the precious bundle. She glanced at Nathan, tears pricking her eyes. And in that moment, they both saw the pain that giving up their daughter had caused each other. Getting to her feet, she allowed them to work. Her arms were empty, her body hollow. Nathan put a comforting arm around her and squeezed. Unconcerned by her witnesses, she allowed her hand to slip around his waist, taking comfort in his strength. "You need to go with them," Downs said, nodding at the paramedics. "I'm fine," Ruby said. "She's coming back to mine," Nathan spoke at the same time. "We need statements," Downs replied, his voice laced with disapproval. Nathan stared, hard-faced. "In the morning, you'll have your statements then." Ruby allowed him to steer her away. Downs would send someone to the house, have them bag up her clothes, and swab her face for forensics. A nod passed between them, and Downs let her go. Chapter 70. Switching off the hairdryer, Ruby gasped as she caught sight of a figure in the bedroom mirror. Nathan. A jittery laugh escaped her lips as she caught her breath in relief. Here, in the home he bought for her, she could not be any safer. It had taken guts for Luddy to attend Nathan's house last night, but it was worth providing a full statement to be allowed a late start today. Ruby had been prepared to go home, but, in his wisdom, Nathan had brought her here. He was right. It was their safe house, and she had never been more grateful for it than today. Exhausted from the emotional turbulence, she had fallen into a nightmarish sleep, her dreams filled with running barefoot down empty corridors, searching for her daughter. "I made you some coffee," Nathan said, his eyes falling on her hair. It had taken 3 boiling hot showers to satisfy her that all traces of blood were washed away. "Thanks," Ruby said, pulling the toweling robe around her, before following him to the sofa. "How did you find me? In the basement, I mean. How did you know where I was?" Ruby asked. She couldn't figure out why Nathan had smashed a window to gain entry to the back, while Downs and his colleagues were at the front. Nathan took a sip from his mug, staring straight ahead. "I was waiting in the car when I searched up plans of the building on my phone. As soon as I saw there was an underground basement, I went in." Ruby smiled. That was Nathan all over. Action first, ask questions later. "My turn now," Nathan said, giving her thigh an impromptu squeeze. "How did you know that Chris was mixed up in it?" "It was little things at first. He insisted the corpses had been washed, but I could tell by Emily's hair that it wasn't clean. Then I saw stamen powder on his coat when I hung mine up next to his at the post-mortem." Ruby lifted her feet and curled up on the sofa, hugging her cup for warmth. "There were lilies at Emily's address, but we wore forensic suits at the scene. Anyone can buy lilies, so I dismissed it from my mind." "What about the others?" Nathan asked. "Monica and Emily." "He disposed of any forensics during the PM. It worked out fine, until I saw Monica's dirty feet. It didn't help that the bodies kept turning up in properties on our books," Nathan said. "That was just a coincidence. Chris lived a couple of doors down from where Monica's body was dumped. Then I read the witness statement, saying he used to be a key holder for the last lot of homeowners when they went on holiday. That's when it all started coming together." Nathan shook his head. "I've come across some messed up shit in my life, but that, why do it? And why did Goldie kill herself afterwards?" "Because she never found her happy ever after. I think all she really wanted was for her mum to love her for who she was, just like in the movies." "Lots of us have crappy childhoods," Nathan said, giving Ruby a knowing glance. "We don't all turn out to be serial killers." "Think about it. Why do you carry a gun?" Ruby asked, staring intensely into his blue-grey eyes. Silence fell between them, and Ruby took another breath before delivering her next question. "Have you ever used it?" Nathan averted his glance. His reluctance to respond was answer enough. "I'm not excusing what Goldie did," Ruby said. "Ending those women's lives, and almost costing Sophie hers. It was a brutal and needless waste of life. But if you're brought up to believe that someone's warped viewpoint is the absolute truth, it's hard to shake it off. Goldie carried the scars of her childhood like a cancer. They infected every aspect of her life." It was the best example she could give to make Nathan understand. Nathan carried a gun. Goldie unleashed her demons. "I heard they found Frenchie's body buried in Chris's basement." Ruby nodded. The excavation of Chris's home was ongoing. "It's why she sent me the death notices. When she saw I had given up my daughter, I think it triggered something inside. Deep down, she wanted to be caught. Or she hated you for what you did and was messing with your mind. Why do you always see the good in people? Even after all these years in the police. Why can't you see these nutters for what they really are?" Ruby delivered a teasing smile, stretching like a cat as she kissed him on the cheek. I see the good in you, don't I? Thanks for coming to my rescue, action man. Nathan tried but failed to hide his smile. He looked at his watch and rose. I'd better get going. There's clean clothes in the wardrobe if you want to go to work from here. Ruby rose with him. I'm still going back to my flat, you know. This isn't permanent. I know. Nathan raised a hand as he made for the door. Call me if you need anything. She stood wanting to call him back. The sight of Nathan leaving sent a bolt of regret. Why was she joking when her daughter had come home? What does she look like? Ruby said, the words feeling too big for her throat. Nathan paused at the door. She's thin, dark hair, as your eyes, my attitude. She's a bit wild, keen to get involved in the family business. Ruby arched an eyebrow as he returned and took her hand. Drawn like magnets, one always returned for one last touch, one more word. She hoped that it would be the same for her daughter, that some way Kathy would find her way back to her. At least now she knew who had been visiting her mother at Oakwood. It gave Ruby hope that Kathy wanted to engage with her grandmother. I'll make sure she keeps her nose clean. Help her get an education, a proper career. It wasn't that long ago that you were telling me that being a criminal was a career, Ruby said, half joking. It's not the one I have in mind for my daughter. My daughter, not ours. Ruby knew she had no right to be upset by his turn of phrase, but it hurt like hell anyway. She thrust her hands into the dressing gown pockets, swallowing back the tightness in her throat. Will you tell her that I've always thought of her, that I'd like to meet? When she's ready to hear it, I will. He sighed. She's a very troubled girl, and I'm going to need your help when she comes around. I'll be right here when she does, Ruby said. So what about you and Leona? I've heard you're getting married. I don't suppose you'll have much room in your life for me then. She knew what she sounded like and hated herself for it, but she had to know. Me and Leona are through, Nathan said ruefully. And what about you? I guess that Jack Downs doesn't seem that bad now I've met him. Ruby smiled at Nathan's efforts of being diplomatic. Work relationships are messy. We're back on a professional basis only. It was a decision she had not been aware of until the words fell from her tongue. Nathan reached out and touched her hair, pushing an errant lock behind her ear. His knuckles brushed her cheekbone, sending a tingle down her spine. I guess I'll see you around, he said, before turning and walking away. Not if I see you first, Ruby called after him, her smile filtering through her words. She padded to the window, opening it wide, absorbing the noise of the streets below. London. The sounds of the traffic were her lullaby, the scent of the streets her perfume. She did not know what the future held, but as long as she was here, she was home. She leaned on the windowsill, basking in the morning sun. Her phone beeped in her dressing gown pocket, alerting her of a text. It was Downs. Are you getting your ass back in here or what? Ruby smiled. Time to get back to work. This has been Death Note, Detective Ruby Preston Crime Thriller Series Book 1, written by Caroline Mitchell. Copyright 2016 by Caroline Mitchell. Production copyright 2016 by Bookouture.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.